Welcome to This Week in Virginia, and a very special welcome to Jeff Schapiro, whom I have not seen for a while, but look forward to seeing in person soon. Jeff is with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, political columnist, analyst. All kinds of good words get written and also can be heard on WVTF Radio IQ, found on Twitter and Facebook and everywhere around the Commonwealth, and sometimes even called on to explain Virginia to folks on the national level. So, Jeff, it's good to have a conversation with you here toward the end of 2021, and I've been thinking about it and wanting to do it. And then when I saw your column in Sunday's paper, Roll Call of Some Who Kept Virginia at Heart, I said, okay, it's time for a Schapiro fix before this year is out. We'll put a link up because people, if they haven't read that particular column, of course they got probably 300 others they could have read in 2021, but to read about those who always remembered Virginia, and tell our viewers a little bit about Spec.
Donald Spec Campen. He was a career Air Force guy. Actually, his association with the military goes back to the Army Air Corps, the predecessor to the Air Force. He was an active Democrat in suburban Richmond, Henrico County, beginning when the county organization was a fairly conservative entity, stuck with it as it swung to the far left and toward the middle, and even as it swung back to the left again. He was 101 when he died.
Wow.
But most people probably remember him, if they encountered him, as the doorkeeper and sergeant at arms in the House of Delegates, and also a very active advocate for Virginia as a venue for film and television production. And that included a number of, dare I say, cameo appearances by Speck in these numerous productions. And in his role as an advocate, it wasn't unusual to see him occasionally in costume at the General Assembly building, the now raised General Assembly building, one time showing up as the Cowardly Lion from The Wizard of Oz.
He was such a delightful person. He really was. Jeff, you talked about two different legislators in that list, Frank Hargrove and Flora Crittenden. Tell us a little bit from your perspective about each of them.
Well, Frank Hargrove, a conservative Republican from largely rural Hanover County. Flora Crittenden, a liberal Democrat from urban Newport News. They could not have been more different in their views and their politics and their approach to policy. But I dare say that there was one issue on which they did find themselves in agreement, and that was capital punishment. Frank Hargrove came to the legislature as a supporter of the death penalty, but the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he was with it. And he made the argument, even as most of his fellow Republicans, all firm law and order folks, argued otherwise. Frank insisted that Virginia do away with its death penalty and substitute life imprisonment. He felt that that was an adequate punishment for those who carry out these heinous capital crimes. What I found interesting is that, of course, Virginia has abolished the death penalty, the first state in the South to do so, the 14th in the nation, as I recall, and that this vote and this initiative was signed into law by Governor Northam about a half a year before Frank Hargrove died at age 93.
Thank you. Thank you. Another one of the people that you featured in the column, you called him a tart-tongued Republican, Kenny Kling. Tell us about Kenny.
Kenny Kling was a professional Republican operative. He was content to remain in the background pretty much at all times, though later in his life, when he switched to lobbying, he became a bit more visible. My first encounter with Kenny Kling was not entirely charitable, but it should have been a sign of a much stronger relationship to come, and Kenny and I got on quite well. He was sent down to Richmond in 1981 by the Republican National Committee to help save Marshall Coleman's Republican candidacy for governor. Coleman was unsuccessful. I had tried to reach Kenny on the phone, and when I finally did and I identified himself, he had no interest in talking and immediately hung up. It was in a way a sign of things to come.
Yeah.
But he had been involved in a number of truly challenging campaigns. The one in which he really established a beachhead as a Virginia hand was the 1973 campaign for governor between Mills Godwin, a Democrat turned Republican, and Henry Howell, the liberal firebrand. Godwin was facing a number of headwinds: Watergate, Richard Nixon, tough economy, gas lines. It looked for a while as if Henry Howell might win. Ken came in and put in place technology that may seem quaint by today's standards, but really had not been widely used in Virginia, and were considered instrumental in helping Godwin to a narrow win. And that technology included regional phone banks and granular polling. As I said, the sorts of things that campaigns use routinely, but a half a century ago, less so in Virginia, a state pivoting from one that was rural dominated to one that was suburban dominated.
Thanks very much. Now, you talked about someone that may not be as well known as some of these others, Wayne OBrien from Hanover County. And tell us about this former delegate.
Well, Wayne OBrien, a lawyer, a legislator, in later life a lobbyist for the Trial Lawyers Association, as I recall. I think what distinguished his career was really how it ended. In 1981, the legislature, in particular the House of Delegates, was struggling with redistricting. Virginia would complete the transition to single-member districts in that redistricting. But in doing so, it meant that Democrats such as Wayne OBrien, representing heavily Republican areas, were going to have their hands full. And so in an attempt to kill what was for him clearly a career-ending map, Wayne OBrien took to the floor of the House of Delegates in an attempted filibuster. He talked and he talked and he talked. And the leadership of the House, the Democratic leadership of the House, was not amused and wired up a question to the verbally rambling gentleman from Hanover. It was a question by Mary Sue Terry, delegate then from rural Patrick County on the south side, the westernmost south side of Virginia. And she asked if the gentleman would yield, let's use legislative parlance. And of course, OBrien, being the gentleman, did. And Terry, rather than ask a question, immediately moved that the map be put to the vote. And in the legislature, a motion for a vote is not one that is subject to debate. And so the roll call was called, the map was adopted, and Wayne O'Brien's career as a Democratic legislator ended.
Oh, that's quite a memory. I take it that you were there and watching when that happened, Jeff.
I was sitting in the well of the house.
You were there. Now, you also mentioned Shirley Little Dove Costello McGowan. Tell us about her.
Yes, descendant of Native Americans, the daughter and granddaughter of chiefs of the Mackinac tribe. These are native peoples now beginning to receive a federal recognition, but state recognized tribes. I would suggest that Miss Costello, the late Miss Costello McGowan, is a reminder of Virginia's diversity, largely overlooked, if not to some degree eradicated, given the emphasis on race in the post-colonial period in Virginia. She would be seen on occasion at the tax-paying ceremonies at the executive mansion when the Mattaponi will present game to the governor as their supposed taxes to the state. But Mrs. Costello McGowan, was also a member of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, a state entity that really sort of emphasized Virginia's colonial past, largely as a whites-only story, or virtually as a whites-only story. So to see her as a Native American, the first on that board, appointed by Governor George Allen, a Republican, was a powerful signal of Virginia's origins and its trajectory. One other thing about Mrs. Costello McGowan, of course, who died this past year, she was retained by the Walt Disney Company as an advisor, as a consultant in its production of the animated feature Pocahontas.
Interesting.
Let's put it this way. She was not happy with the product and made very clear in on-the-record interviews that it was a highly inaccurate depiction of Pocahontas.
And Henry Willett, a name that some will recall and will know some current connections, but tell us about him.
Well, Henry Willett, the Longwood College president, a son of an educator who'd been Richmond superintendent, I believe also state superintendent of public instruction. At Longwood, over a 14-year presidency, he came in at age 36, guiding the school through racial desegregation and repositioning it as a coeducational institution. Longwood had been a school reserved for women, many of whom were trained to be teachers, educators, school administrators. I guess Longwood College would qualify as what in the olden days was known as a normal school. Willett is also the late father of a member of the House of Delegates, Rodney Willett, a Democrat from suburban Richmond, from Henrico County, who was just reelected this year.
And Roberta Bobby Scruggs. Known by some, but not by others. It was great to read about her.
Bobby Scruggs. One couldn't go to a Henrico Republican event without encountering Bobby Scruggs. She had, and I say this with love, respect, and admiration, she had a personality disorder, too much of one. She was a hard-charging, enthusiastic, and reliable Republican volunteer. And it didn't make a difference whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. If she liked you, she stuck with you. And you could not miss Bobby Scruggs with her big smile, her robust verbal style, and this shock of platinum hair.
Yes, I do recall her. I think I've saved for last on this particular column the one who was the youngest among those that you featured, known to us around Capitol Square as Buddy. Talk about him.
You were speaking of course, of Buddy Dowdy. Buddy Dowdy was posted to the guard box at the west entrance of Capitol Square. He was often the first person visitors to the square encountered. He was always beaming. He always inquired after the folks he knew, a casualty of COVID-19. At 60, he had spent half of his life as an officer of the Capitol Police Department. This is an agency that traces its origins back to the early 1600s, and the guards who kept an eye on the early overseers of Virginia.
Jeff, I think I have the feeling that if you'd been writing this a week from now instead of writing it to be published this past Sunday, you probably would have been including Russ Potts.
For sure. And there were a couple of others who died in the past year who I might have mentioned, but frankly, there just wasn't space. But H. Russell Potts, a state senator from Winchester, not unlike Bobby Scruggs, had that personality disorder, too much of one. He was somewhat Napoleonic in his countenance, with this great stride and this incandescent smile. He was an advocate, and an effective advocate, largely because he was a professional promoter, a sports promoter. He'd been a journalist as well, but he had a big role in building out the profiles of some of the larger public university sports programs in the country, Southern Methodist University in Texas, but most notably at his alma mater, the University of Maryland. He came to the legislature in 1991 as a fairly conservative, standard brand Republican, but over the years became concerned about the rightward lurch of his party. He would trash the Republicans for their preoccupation with gods, guns, and gays, and finally had his fill of his own party, but wasn't quite prepared to join the other. And in 2005, made an independent run for governor. Tim Kaine was the Democratic nominee, and the eventual winner, Jerry Kilgore, the Republican candidate. Russ pulled just over 2% of the vote, but 16 years later, we still talk about his candidacy, largely because of that very clever television commercial that he ran of people banging on pots and pans, saying We want Potts.
Yes, quite a character. Well, Jeff, I'm sure that among the current members of the Senate and the House, you encountered many other characters. I do want to say, for the folks who follow you on Twitter and for those who maybe go back to your main page on Twitter, they may find it interesting that you have former Governor Wilder and former Speaker of the House A.L. Philpott there. And I think they're smiling at each other, or at least Governor Wilder may be smiling. I'm not sure that Speaker Philpott did much smiling. But to put you, I could never put you on the spot because you're too good with answers, but how come you have those two on your Twitter page?
That photograph was made by a photographer for the Virginian Pilot. It was made at Governor Wilder's swearing in 1990. Of course, Governor Wilder, the first African-American, first elective Black governor in the United States. Philpott, as the Speaker of the House, at the time, was also the presiding officer at the inauguration, because technically the inauguration is a special session of the legislature. And Doug Wilder and A.L. Philpott, as legislators, Doug Wilder served 16 years in the state Senate before moving to statewide office, first lieutenant governor, then governor. But Wilder and Philpott had their differences as members of the General Assembly. They were personal. They were political to some degree. They were also institutional. Philpott serving the House, Wilder serving in the Senate. But both of them, if you will, skilled gamesmen.
Yes, and I guess some say that former Speaker and now former Governor, that the former Speaker embracing Wilder really helped propel him to his victory. Was a part
That is
of
true.
it.
In 1985, when Wilder was running for lieutenant governor, Speaker Philpott organized a breakfast in Wilder's behalf at a hotel in Henry County, again, rural South Side, westernmost rural South Side. My late colleague, Tyler Whitley, had a wonderful lead advancing that story. It was, guess who's coming to breakfast?
Yes, and Tyler.
I mean, a powerful image of a white, rural, conservative Democrat embracing a standard brand, liberal, inner city Democrat. As you'll recall, Wilder was elected comfortably. His victory for governor 4 years later, a much narrower majority.
Jeff, before I would let you go and thank you for your commentary on these people, your comments and your insight and their contributions, looking out the window, we know that the inauguration is going to be taking place soon. The new General Assembly will be sworn in even before that. So how about some comments about the upcoming session that you would make? So we'll switch from the characters of the past to perhaps even the characters of the moment and the upcoming year. What comments would you share?
Well, there's a lot that's new, of course, about Virginia government as we approach 2022. A new governor, Glenn Youngkin, if you will, a virginal governor, having never, ever served in government or had a hand in politics before. He was the head of a very successful publicly traded private equity firm. So he knows how to run a business, but running a government can be a very different experience. We also have a divided legislature, the Republicans having taken back the House of Delegates from the Democrats. Democrats controlling the legislature in its entirety for barely 2 years. There'll be a new Speaker of the House, Todd Gilbert from Shenandoah County, a conservative rural Republican who, despite his seemingly menacing countenance, he's a very tall fellow, a very ample build, with a shaved head and sort of a menacing scowl. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's Philpott-like, but Todd Gilbert is a very clever, very droll, very patient, very witty fellow. So he will no doubt be an important ally to the new governor, as Governor-elect Youngkin, at this point, tries to guide his agenda through this divided legislature. Of course, over in the Senate, there is still a Democratic majority, albeit a very narrow Democratic majority. And given the maverick-like tendencies of several of the Democrats, there may be some opportunities in the House of Lords, as we know, the Senate, to perhaps get some of these Youngkin-backed ideas, perhaps including restrictions on abortion, through the legislature and signed into law.
Well, Jeff Schapiro, we will end it there with your good words, and we thank you very much. And we'll be following you on Facebook and Twitter, and the Times-Dispatch and the Radio IQ station that we will hear you on. And we thank you for your work in highlighting the people that you did in this column on December 17th, and now again on our show. And thank you, and have a great rest of the holiday season, and I hope to see you in 2022.
Thank you, David. Happy Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thank you.